Welcome to the second week of me building a self-tracking app in Svelte 5. And in this week, we're gonna start making the app actually look like we had imagined it in our Figma designs. It's looking a bit dull right now, wouldn't you say? But it's time to actually start creating some of these components in Svelte and hooking them up with this new variable graph system that we implemented last week so that we can get some basic functionality of tracking things. I also want to focus a bit on the forms this week because they are a very fundamental part of the application. We need to be able to input things in a wide variety of ways. But let's start coding now. Alright, so now I have implemented that trackable value store that I had in my diagrams before. So now we can have trackables that display multiple values, and this displays the last 10 days worth of values. And that's because this is supposed to be a chart trackable. So when we have a charting library, we will actually be able to render a chart here with these values. Currently we have 0, but if I were to log something, we can now see we get 100. If I go back in time, log maybe 50 on this Saturday, we can see that this 50 starts appearing. So you can now imagine that we would have some form of a line chart where you would see it being completely at the bottom and then go up a bit here on the Saturday and then an even larger value for today. So how did I implement this? Well, I just implemented this very similarly, but we now have a trackable value store. So instead of having to go through that variable store and having to pass in the trackable ID or the trackable dependency as a variable, we have a trackable value store instead. And what does this do? Well, it checks if this card type is a chart, then we want to use this ranged variable store instead. And what does this do? Well, it will just fetch trackable values for count amount of times. So in this case, I sent in 10, and then it will just fetch that offsetted from whatever date that you passed in here. So we'll offset 10 days back in time, and we'll add all of them to a list and then just return that. So, and this is where I really love Svelte stores as well. We can also make a derived on this store here. So we select either we want a ranged variable store or we want a normal variable store, and then we just derive on this store. So whenever this store updates value, then we will just update this value as well, and that will just be whatever this resolved value is. But now I feel like it's time to actually add some forms to this application. It's kind of dull having to input everything to this native prompt. You can't really have that much degrees of freedom in your answers, not have any selects or any cool other ways of inputting data. So I want to focus a bit on the form stuff as well. Alright, so now I have implemented a very basic form system where you can actually start inputting some values. So I can go ahead and input some values here, maybe ABC and 5. And if I log this now, I can see that this maps to the form question and also with the actual value that we have inputted. And I also implemented some basic validation for this, so you can set up specific rules as a user that you want perhaps to have a min value or a max value. In this case, we have a max value of 20. So if I try to log this, it actually fails and it returns null because there were errors. Because simply this value is too large. And it was implemented quite nicely because I could set up these definitions. Inside of all of these we have definitions like this text form question data type If we validate it, then we check in the settings. If the max length is not met, then we simply return an error to the user. And we can validate them, we can return the default settings, and keeping everything encapsulated inside of this class. And we can also return a list of the supported display types that are able to render this form of data. We will have the same here for hierarchies and selects and rich text. And then we have a simple mapping here of the form question display type to the actual Svelte component that is responsible for rendering it. So I'm quite happy with this design. Maybe we'll make some changes in the future, but I think this is a good solid starting ground for the form system. Of course, now there are only input fields, there are no selects or hierarchies or range selects, but that's all really implementing them in these components and setting up the proper definitions. So that should be pretty easy to do. But I am happy with this work for today, so I will see you guys another day. Good morning, sunshine. So today I want to start working on the modals and try to make things a little bit more mobile friendly as well. So you have to consider that this is going to be a mobile app as well, and most people will probably be using it on their phone. So I need to really target mobile first and focus on that early on, and perhaps set some good guidelines for how I want things to look on mobile. So that's something I want to focus on for this morning. Let's get going. Alright, so now I managed to implement quite a nice modal that I also hooked up with the form. So if I want to create a new trackable and then log it, we can see this nice little modal pop up. And we have a basic question that is also tied to the trackable's variable. So whenever I input something here and save it, boom, it gets logged. And of course, we also have some validation here. So if this value is too large, we won't log it. And I also started trying to make this a bit more mobile friendly. So this layout here is by no means mobile friendly, but this trackable or this log form modal is a bit more mobile friendly. You can see this top bar that is completely different. We don't have any footer with any buttons. We have a different layout being rendered when we are on mobile. And of course this also works here. So I'm pretty happy with that. Alrighty, so now we have this pretty nice looking view. It's also looking a lot more like the Figma design that I had. But we also added this Chart.js library. So now I can log this, it will open a form modal, and I can also see that this chart will update. So starting to look a lot more like I had imagined it will look as a finished product. And we also started working a bit on the edit trackable modal, so we can have this form of modal with different sorts of tabs to go between. And this form button here is supposed to open a new page. It's supposed to redirect me to another page. Yeah, so I think I want to focus a bit on the form editor today as well, because we want to be able to create forms. That's going to be an integral part of this application. So that's what I'm going to focus on for the next couple of hours. Alrighty, so now I have built this pretty nice little form editor view where you can edit the form questions. So I can click on this form question, I can see the name, I can also see the data type and display type of the question and change it. So depending on the data type or display type, we will render different settings components. So if I have this number, well, I can change the max and min value. I can also switch to a text, and then we'll have min length and max length. If I wanted to, I can also switch to a select, and here I can add new options. It's just very rudimentary right now, but just a proof of concept of this system. And yeah, I'm pretty happy with this as well. It's very similar to how I've done everything else in the system with dynamic components. We just have this sort of record where we map the display type to a specific component that we want to render. And then I'm using bindable in Svelte. So I'm just binding these objects mutably. So whenever we update perhaps this min length, then the object itself will be updated. Which is pretty neat. It's quite powerful now with Svelte, and it's also much clearer with Svelte 5 how these bindings are actually working under the hood. And in order to make this work on a different page as well, I'm using Svelte 5 routers. I installed a package called Svelte 5 router. I'm not yet sure if that's what I'm going to keep using for the future because it's not a hash-based router. So this will not work if I were to deploy this on a server. It wouldn't work because I would have to actually use full routes, and we just want to serve it from a single index route, so to speak. So it's not going to work for deployed, but for development purposes it's really nice, and it's very simple. Here in app.svelte I can just define very easy the routes that I want to have, and also specify that I want to have a parameter in the URL. And then when I load this component in this effect, I will get the parameter from the props. So I can just pass in the form ID and get it fetching the form, fetching all the questions and everything. Alrighty, so now I have implemented the ability to change the card type of my trackables. So I can go into the trackable and change it to perhaps a value instead. And when it's a value, it will instead render as a table. And I can also decide which values I want to show in this table. In this case, I'm showing the value of this test question, but I can also show test 2. And I can even change here. If I go back to having a chart, I can see the sum of those. I can see the sum of those, and I can even set this to be an average aggregation instead. So it will sum them up and divide them by the count, the basic maths. If we save that now, we can see that it's instead calculating the average of these values, and that should hopefully sum up correctly. If we go back to having a value here, we see all of these values divided by 3, I suppose. Presumably it sums up correctly. So all of that is pretty nice. Now we can change which question we want to show on these cards, which should make it really useful for the user. And this was quite a lot of work to get working actually, because we needed a way to save this state. When we click and want to edit a trackable, we need to somehow fetch what kind of aggregation type it has or what representation it has. So I moved some of that into this store so we can get the edit trackable state. And if it's a chart, then we need to get the variable, because the variable will be the single source of truth. We're not going to store this redundantly many times over this aggregation type or things like that. We're instead going to have it stored inside of the variable itself. And then we can update the card state, and for this we then have different sorts of settings. So for a chart we have no settings because it's stored in the variable, but for a value trackable then we will have the representation of what to store in this trackable table. Alrighty, so I had a pretty productive morning actually. I implemented this nice little sidebar. It's definitely temporary for now, but it's allowing me to switch. And I actually implemented this little journal view. I reused many of the components from the previous version of this app. Pretty much all of these journal components were reused, but now we have a grouping system. So we group these journal entries by the day, and we also group them based on what form it is. So if we have multiple entries on a single day, we will show them in this layout. Otherwise, we show them as big cards. I also added the ability to update these entries. So if I were to go into testing here and change this to 10 and save, and then go back, I will see that this value is 10. If I were to lower it down to 7 and update it, boom, we can see that that has been updated. So really happy with this progress. I also added some sort of infinite scrolling. So whenever the scroll bar reaches the bottom here, we will attempt to load more entries. So I implemented this here as a journal view. So when we scroll, I used to have Svelte windows. When we scroll this page, I check if we have reached the bottom, and then we just go to the next page where we have this journal store. So we keep track of the paging. And then I have this little offset function, which will offset by a specific page count. And then we will update with the new entries as they come in. And this is then utilizing this grouped journal, which I had in my design. So this is a Svelte store that is simply listening for the journal entry store. And what it does is that it has some logic for grouping these entries. We map them into their timestamp for their specific form IDs. And then we just create this sort of structure that is very easy to render. So this is the whole point of having it separate to the components, is that we can create a data structure that will be easy to render in the Svelte view. So we have these days, I have a journal day card, and then I can simply loop over them. I have a little grid layout. So all the multi-entries will have a multi-group, and the single entries will have a single group. And then we have some reused components between the two of them. So pretty happy with this design and happy with this morning's work. So all in all, I'm pretty happy with this week's work. We have a system that somewhat resembles that of our designs, and it's coming together as a system where you can now log things, but also update these forms if you're unhappy with the layout or the questions that you are setting to yourself. And you can also see all of your entries in the journal and even update entries, and all of this is working reactively with these values being displayed. And we also even have tables now. I can even change this to be a table if I want to show things in a different representation. So next week, I hope to keep up with this productivity and make it look even better, and perhaps even start playing with some mobile technologies, seeing all the alternatives out there, and see if we can put this on a mobile device somehow and see how all of that works, since it's going to be the main target platform of this app. But I want to thank you for following me on this journey for yet another week. I hope to see you next week as well. Also feel free to join my Discord channel if you want to be part of the community. But other than that, I'll see you guys next week. Peace out.